So in the siman that we're learning right now in Kolel siman Kuf Tzaddik, there's an aspect, an element of the siman that gets into the topic of shiurim in Torah, measurements in halacha. Now, it goes without saying, it's quite well known that in recent generations there have been various chilukei deis, disagreements, differences of opinion regarding various shiurim in halacha. And that's connected to the fact that throughout the generations, Tanakh, Chazal, and even till pretty recently, there were no universal, official measurement systems. If you wanted to express a measurement, there was no universal measurement for small things. Inches, centimeters, millimeters, etc. To take an example from units of length, and the same goes for all other types of units. But rather, the measurements were derived from everyday life, right? So you have an etzba, an agudal, is a finger. Tefach is 4 fingers, a fist. An amma is an arm, which is a number of tvachim. Now, along the way with Chazal, you'll find sometimes, even in Tanakh and Chazal, you'll find in the context of different discussions that a particular object is this shiur, and another object is a different shiur, etc. Then as time went on, due to these circumstances and how the halachas are described, it's possible, and in fact it happened, that this creates confusion as time goes on. Both from the fact that etzba, tefach, and amma, it's not so, which finger, which hand, which arm, right? So there's a variation there. And also, due to different logical conclusions, different rayas, you can be, and this chazal, it's mashma, this object is like this shiur. That must mean that this shiur is this size. From that chazal, it's mashma, this object is this shiur, must mean that shiur is that size. So you start getting lost in the thicket of these different proofs, and can keep you occupied. And that's indeed what happened. Now, in the last 100 years, once the new official measurements, whether it's inches or centimeters or meters, finally took root, they took hold. So until now, it's possible, we don't know what every person in every shtetl did, but they didn't have measurements. So everything up until 100 years ago or so, depending on where you live, everything was sort of generalized. Now that we have the measurements exist and the measuring tools exist and everyone can do this at home, so now all the ambiguity should vanish, and now we expect to have exact, precise shiurim that we can measure scientifically. But when it came time to do that, that's when all the chilukei deis, that's when all the disagreements, differences of opinion came to a head, and now we have an official split, so to speak, within the halachic world, with different people following different systems of shiurim. So in Hilchos Nida that we're learning now, we have, of course, one of these old types of ancient shiurim from life, which also ended up with many sveikas, many questions and doubts, and that even happened long before the last 100 years, as we shall see. And in fact, till today, there are different opinions, and in each general opinion, there are chilukei deis as to practically what it's supposed to look like. And that, of course, is the shiur of the Gris, which we'll discuss in this shiur. And for your benefit, in preparation for this shiur, I went through about more than a dozen articles and essays on this topic that tackle it from all different angles. And I'm going to try to summarize it and concentrate it here to the best of my ability. And afterwards, I'll be happy to share links or sources to these different makayos. Of course, if you've already learned some of these in Yana, if you looked into it a bit, some of this should probably be familiar to you. So the makar of this shiur, where does this idea, there's a shape, the size of a gris, it comes from a Mishnah Nida. Perek Haraya Kesem, Perek Ches Mishnah Beis. It says, after introducing the idea of Haraya Kesem Al Bsara Keneged Beis HaTurpa Tmeya, so the Mishnah Beis says, V'toila b'chol davar shehi yachoyle litlois. You can blame it on as many things you can come up with. etc., etc. Harga machaylas harezu toilaba. If she killed a louse is a unit of lice, then harezu toilaba. She could say that's the source of the kesem. Ad kama hi toila, specifically in a case of a machaylas, how big can the kesem be, and blame it on the machaylas. Reb Chanina ben Antignas oimer ad ke gris shel poil. So that's where the size comes from. The Mishnah, Gris shel poil. And even if she doesn't, it means even if she's not aware of killing anything, it's not like the other cases where she knows she was near blood. The whole idea is that she doesn't have to know, but we could just assume that ad ke gris shel poil, it's fine. The Gemara adds a few more details to the sugya, but this is more or less the bottom line. Now, l'chayr, where did this shiur come from? The pashtos, since the whole din of ksamim, of course, is midrabanan. And there's a line you find, v'heim amru. You actually see later the Miltstaka uses this line. So they're the ones who created ksamim, and they're the ones who created tliya b'ksamim, to be mekel. So it seems like Chazal, as they were creating this din, they looked into the lice question, and based on what they saw in everyday life, they decided that the size of the gris is probably the best size, and it's a helpful, useful, common, everyone knows what a gris is back then. That's going to be the size that will tell people, and that's what corresponds to the thing we're talking about, the machayelas. Where else do we find the shiur of a gris? So we find it, of course, in Negoim Tsaras, the shiur of a beheres, like you find beheres kegris, and in fact, that's where more of the discussion, maybe the main discussion about the shiur, can be found in Chazal and Rishonim. Right? So if you look at Mesachas Negoim Perek Vav, Gufa shel beheres kegris hakilki meruba. So now we're being told about a different type of gris, perhaps, a gris hakilki, and it's square. Mekayma gris, and then the Mishnah teaches us, it says, Mekayma gris teisha adashais. The space of the gris can also be translated into 9 lentils. Mekayma adasha arba sairas, and each lentil is 4 hairs. And of course in Tsaras, hairs is part of the discussion in Tsaras. Nimtzu shleishim v'sheish sa'ara. So that corresponds, if you take the gris and you turn it into 9, 3 times 3, and each one is 4, that comes out to a total of 36. And of course we'll get back to these details soon. What's the marker for the shiur there? So if you look in the Rambam in Hilchos Tumas Tsaras, after he mentions these different figures, he says, V'chol shiurin halach l'meishem misinai. That was the tradition. Tradition was, unlike the previous din, here's the tradition in Torah that it's this size. And Pashtos, there's a difference between the gris here and the gris there, because there, it would seem the main thing is the hair. The hair is a measurement of skin. We're talking about a measurement of skin. The only one of these 3 things that's on the skin are the hairs. So the original shiur probably was the hairs. The example of the gris probably did not come by Kabbalah, but then Chazal saw that, the shiur of the gris that we use, that we're familiar with, fits very nicely with the shiur we have a Kabbalah of 36 items. But the result is the same. Both are shiur gris. Now we keep on repeating these words. Gris shel poil, gris hakilki. We haven't explained them yet. I'm afraid some people who are talk, even when you come across it in learning, not everyone necessarily stops to ask, what exactly are these things? So here, of course, it's very important to stop and ask that. What is a gris? What is a poil? And what is kilki? Now, before I continue, I just want to point out that what we end up seeing here is somewhat interesting, and it gives you a perspective into the overall development of how shiurim came to develop over the generations. Right? Originally, it says in the Mishnah gris. So what's the question? What's a gris? Come Chazal or Rishonim and take from Chazal. There's also adashus. There's also cyrus. So in the time of the Rishonim, in the beginning of the Acharayim, the discussion shifts. They're no longer discussing what a gris is anymore. Now the discussion is, what are adashus? How do you measure them? Comes the Me'il Tzedakah, as we shall see, and he was the first one who tried to make some kind of cheshbon with the tools that he had available in his day, and to make some kind of formal shiur. The way he was going to publicize it is by printing a shape on paper. Come the Acharayim, and they start arguing about the Me'il Tzedakah's shape. So it's just a cycle, and whatever you come along and explain, that becomes the focus of the next discussion. Comes the Alter Rebbe and changes his mind, as we know, or as we shall see, and says a different shiur. And he mentions some contemporary coins from around his time. Come the Achrayim, or the people alive today, being Isaac in this Inyan, and there's a big machlokes about the coin of the Alter Rebbe. So again, the cycle continues. And in fact, as we shall see, there are some out of Chabad who even disagree as to whether the Alter Rebbe really changed his mind. And this, in other words, is one framework you can give for the shiur. We're going to sort of move from Gris to Adashim, to the shape of the Mi'ot Tzedakah, to the coins of the Alter Rebbe, etc. I just want to point out that we do have a shiur, a special shiur planned for Monday evening by someone who's looked specifically into the question of the coins of the Alter Rebbe, the coins the Alter Rebbe uses also to describe the shiur of the Mi'ot Tzedakah. And I'm trying to leave that department to him, and we're going to discuss other aspects of this issue. So getting back to our focus right now, the shiur Gris, which, as we said, it seems that at some point they just stopped discussing the Gris, and instead they're discussing the secondary shiurim, etc. But today, dafka in this generation, with all the information we have now, with all the research into the ancient world, there are some who have returned to focus on what is actually the original Gris. Can we figure that out? Out of the belief that it is possible to reconstruct and figure these types of things out. And again, there were some along the course of generations who did this as well. But first, let's translate the words. So, a poil, of course, is a bean. Simple. Kilki in English would be pronounced Cilician beans. Cilicia is a region north of Eretz Yisrael. It's still there in Turkey today. You can look it up. So it sounds like there was some variety not too far from Eretz Yisrael that might have been slightly different. That's a poil, and that's what's Gris? So one of the articles on the topic, they point out that the definition of Gris actually depends on the context. Sometimes it means ground beans, and sometimes, like in this context, it just means, more of a grinding situation. But in this case, and Makaitis like this, it means just split down the middle. The bean itself has a bit of a double aspect to it, so you can just split it in half, and then you have the half a bean, still the same height, and etc. It's just flatter. That seems to be the idea. Once it's flatter, it's easier to measure. Now we have to make note of the differences between a goyim and nida. In the Mishnah in the goyim it said, Gris ha-kilki. Here in nida it said, Gris shel poil, without specifying. Also in the goyim, it spelled out the adashim, which of course are lentils, as we said, which are much smaller. And the hairs, which actually, like we said, has more to do with Nagayim. It's not mentioned in nida. And as one of the people points out, there are other significant differences between Nagayim and Nida. The two big ones being that in Nagayim, a Gris is already Tameh. In Nida, up till a Gris is Tar. It has to be Gris V'oid. And also, fundamental differences that in Nagayim, it has to be square. It actually has to have that square shape. And in Ksamim, it doesn't have to be the shape, as long as you have that same space. But already the Rambam, where he writes Hilchas Nida, which are, of course, in the Hilchas Yisurei Bia, Perek Tes, the Rambam already conflates or connects the two halachas. The Rambam writes about Nimtza ala beged ein metame, ad sheyeh kagris hakilki, shehu meruba, sheyesh boi kedei teisha adashas, shalosh al shalosh. So he's talking about Nida, and he copies all of these Lashonos from Nagayim. The Farshim pointed out, he got it from Nagayim. Look in the Torah, like Gazir ala Kasem, unless there's a Gris v'oid, Gris is tasadashas. As long as it's not the shear, we say to damkina, even if she didn't actually go and kill one. Once you have the shear, you can't be tailor bekina. Whether it's meruba, shleisha adashas al shleisha, oyim hu arech. So the Torah adds this, says this clearly. Doesn't matter if it's meruba or arech. And then he brings another Hagdar from the Ramban. The Ramban said, if she somehow finds even a bigger one, if you happen to have a large gris, so you can use that and say, as long as the stain is not as big as this gris. It implies, of course, that they didn't actually keep anything in their office to check consistently. In this time you got this bean, this time you got that bean. The Beis Yosef comments, and the Kitzer, he says, when the Torah writes, Gris hu tes adashis, that's the Rambam, who made the connection, and the Rashba and Teres Abayis as well, goes along with that. And the reason is, because in the Goyim, that's what it says. And then you have Ashkenazi Mekaydas, the Augur, B'Shem the Maharil, also says that Shiur Gris, Takel, Inyan Nida is Tisha Adashim. And from there, it ends up in Shulchan Aruch. So on the one hand, from the Ramban, and the Rashba, who also mentions that Lashon of the Ramban, sounds like they're still talking about looking at actual grisim, actual beans. But in the Ashkenazi Mekaydas that we just quoted, the Augur, Maharil, etc., it sounds already like they're shifting their focus to focusing on the Adashim. And in fact, there is a unique shita in Rishonim, in Sefer Yereim. The Yereim wrote, V'anan loy bekinon shapir, mahu gris shel poel. We don't actually know what this is. Hilchach tzarech lihizar b'ksamin lefi shikol hadas she'ein dam ma'chayla supar eishem rabba. He combines this with another point. We don't know, we're not sure what a gris shel poel is. Along with the idea that, wait a second, are lice that big? Think of how big a bean is, and think how big a louse is, and think about how much blood you can get from a louse. Shouldn't be that much. So he combines the two things together to say that we should just go with our instinct as to just go look at the lice and try to judge based on that. This Yereim is cited in the Pischei Tshuva here on the Daf, and by other Achreinim, but even though he seemingly has a good argument, and as we shall see, even those who have identified today, they say, well, we can identify the louse and the bean, his point still stands, his observation still stands, but Ruba the Achreinim say that we just accept what Chazal said and that's it. So from then on, we find almost no discussion about Poilim and Grisim directly, and the discussion shifts to the Adashim. And that's going to be the main focus once we get there. But actually, to be honest, we don't really find much of a discussion at all in the Rishonim, certainly not more than a line here or a line there. And the big discussion actually starts in the 1700s with the Me'il Tzedakah, as we shall see. However, there is one Chashuv Makar that dealt with it, among other things, he was a little before the Me'il Tzedakah, and that is the Chacham Tzvi. There's one detail of what he says that actually made it here into Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and more of it was cited in the Pischei Tshuva on the Daf. But let's take a look at the Chacham Tzvi. Shut Chacham Tzvi, Siman Samach Zayin. Starts with the date and the place, Prague, Tov Samach Daled, 1704, so also already in the 1700s. He was asked, Advar Shiur Kesem Kegris, Im Yesh Biyodi Eze Dover Ma, Mipi Avoisai V'Raboisai Hakdoshim. You're asking me if I have any information, was anything transmitted? Tshuva, Ein iti Dover Mekubal Mipi Avoisai. I have no facts to share, which itself seems to be pretty interesting. Seems to be a pretty important halacha, and it doesn't seem like there was much of a tradition, much of an ongoing discussion. He goes on to say, Kedaihem, the Ravid, the Ramban, and the Rashba, we can rely on them, Afilu be'Isser Torah, Kol Shekain Ksamim, which are mainly Medivrei Seifrim, as it says in a Mishnah, Le'omru Chacham Hadavar Lahachmir Ala Lahakal. The Gemara says, Kol Shiuri Chachamim Lahachmir, Chutz Mikagris Shel Ksamim Lahakal. There's this trend of being makel here. And he points out, by the way, the person asking the question, when you were writing about this, you were concerned. It's very important, Ksamim. So you wrote, Isser Torah, I'm very concerned. It's not an Isser Torah. It's very important to observe this. Not an Isser Torah. It's Ikodim Divrei Sefer. Now he says, there's a question though for Harav HaChassid. You had these titles long before the Chassidic movement. Harav HaChassid, Reb Shmuel Aboyav, in his Sefer Siman Aleph. So this is referring, it doesn't say the name of the Sefer, but it's referring to the Sefer Shalos Teshuvas Dvar Shmuel. It had been printed just 2 years before this Shuvah in Venice, Tov Samach Beis, after Shmuel Abova passed away. And there's a long Shuvah, you could perhaps say the first long Shuvah in Achreinim, about the Gris addressed to two Chachamim and Tzvas, and it mainly focuses on just going through all the Mekayos and Chazal, which can be a big mess if you actually delve deeply into them. So one of the questions was, how could it be that if I find a larger poil, then somehow the lice has more blood now? That's essentially this vart from the Ramban, that you find the bigger one, be mashar with the bigger one. How does that work? Ants have more, lice have more blood. So, Lav Kushi, he says that's not a question, because they hold, that Chachamim hold, that the largest pile in the world is never larger than the Shiur of Dama Chaylas. You just have to take Chazal's word for it, and the Rishonim's understanding of Chazal. He says there are other questions there as well. We're not going to get into the technicalities, but the Chacham Tzvi's takeaway is that if we don't have enough information as to what size this Gris is supposed to be, we ought to assume that it's large. You can't say that it's Katan Beinani, but Chazal said, Gris shel Ksamim hu lahakal. So we should assume that we're going with the largest, most lenient size. Harav Chassid Zal, Shmuel Abov said I could interpret that memra other ways. Ein Svara Loimar, that the Gris of Ksamim should be smaller than the Gris of Nagayim. And he says even if Shmuel Abov was maskim, even though he's always machmir, but you see that Shmuel Abov doesn't want to start up with the Raiva, the Ramban, and the Rashba, who say just go with the largest. The next problem is, what about the Adasha? The Adasha itself is a problem. Because in Nagayim it says that the Gris HaKilki is like Teisha Adashas. In Kolel it says, Mesechus Kolel, Adasha she'amru, loy gedoyle v'loy ktana, ela beininis zumitris. So Stam Adasha in Shiur Chazal is the Adasha beininis or the Adasha mitris. Now the Chacham Tzvi says, I remember when I was in Constantina, as we know, Chacham Tzvi is partially, in part, named that way because even though he had an Ashkenazi background, he spent time in Turkey, in the east. He says, I remember when I was there, they actually imported Adasha Mitzrius, if you actually want to try to go with the words Chazal say. And he says they were bigger than the lentils that they imported from Egypt to Turkey were larger than lentils here in Europe. And that's the one bit that's actually cited here by the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe writes in Sifkatan Yud Gimel, Ba'ayin Shivas Chacham Tzvi, the Hamitzrius, Gedoylos Mishalonu. So that's the context for that. And interestingly, this is not the only time you see the Chacham Tzvi's familiarity with those countries comes in handy when it comes to Maror and Pesach. So in Europe, Bahrain became the Maror. But the Chacham Tzvi comes along and says, I was in other countries and the real maror is lettuce. And Bahrain is not mentioned in the Mishnah, and that's a whole discussion in its own right, but it's interesting to see like a pattern with Chacham Tzvi. So we have these Makairis, but in the last perek of Maiseris, it says, Adashin HaMitzri is Pturim in HaMaiseris, and the Rambam writes that they're pointy at one end, and that the reason why they're Patur from Maiseris is because they're in the desert, so they're from Hefker. We never saw any such Adashim. But let's just go with Rav Abov and others who say that let's just go with the Adashim that we know. Let's not get too caught up in is it the right one, is it not the right one? And this idea, you go lahakal. And he says, you see in Hilchas Nagayim, when the Rambam writes the Shiur over there, he doesn't mention the Adashas, even though the makar of the Adashas is from the Mishnah in Nagayim, but the Rambam in Nagayim skips the Adashas. He just writes the 36 Cyrus. That was enough for the Rambam in Nagayim. Davka by Dinei Kesem, where the Mishnah didn't mention anything, that's where he mentions the Teisha Adashas. And he doesn't mention the word mitzvahs or beinanis, these words from Kolel. So when it comes to the word beinani, it could be he was just relying on samach al hamevin, that if you don't say otherwise, you should assume it's the beinani. But when it comes to mitzvahs, why didn't the Rambam specify? True. But he's writing for everyone. Nira, he says, Shaloi chashla b'dinei haksamim. Must mean that it doesn't matter. You don't have to take it too seriously. You don't have to get hung up on the adasha. And that means that anybody can take 9 average, the Beinonius we're going to assume, so take 9 average lentils, and anyone could do that. It's not complicated. And that's Haka the Psak of Harav Chassid Hanal, even though he's always machmir, although he didn't get into the adashim question so much. And now we get the reason why I'm quoting this, which is, what about the original Shiur? What about the bean? He says, V'im tirtze l'shar b'gris shel poil. What if you just want to go with the original? So he says, it's clear, Adover Butter, Shehu Hamin Hanikra Baloshan Ashkenaz Bonin. and that's the word in German till today for beans, bunnen, it's the same word essentially. And he says here, we have two minin. There's one called Turkische bunnen, Turkish beans, and they happen not to have any teiloim. He says my grandfather, the Shiur Ephraim, that was the only bean he would eat for this reason. And there's another min called, he spells it archaically, but it's clearly Gris bunnen, large beans, big beans. They are much buggier. You see in Simon Peidalad in the Hilchos Teilaim, it mentions Teilam hanimtzom b'poilin, so poilin is the beans. So this min, taka, the Gris bunnen, if you take the big bean, after you split it in half, which is the way it grows, so you just split the two in half, then a taka is like a merubah. It's a bit like a square, which is what it said in the Goyim, Gris hakilki merubah. So, uva yesh l'shayr la'ani yazdaiti halacha l'maisa. So, absolutely, you could just go to the store and get a bean and go with that. Get to that in a second. And if you're going to ask, how could a louse's blood be that large? So you tell him, much bigger chidushim in Chazal. Davar she'ein mekabel tumah, ein mekabel ksamim. How about that? What's up with that? Remekel. Or badka karka oilam, or something that's not mekabel tumah, and she sat on it, and then she stood up, and she found the kasem gadol, kikama gris and tahira. It all comes back to the same thing he says. Midrabanon, hey mamru v'hei mamru. The Cham Tzvi said it, hey mamru v'hei mamru. And they must have known that there is something that big. So you don't have to be concerned. Malas kvei terasa. Don't be concerned about Isser Kadas. Clearly, whoever it was concerned about being mekel in these shiurim because it's Isser Kadas. Even if Ikanida is Bekadas, Ksamim is not Isser Kadas anyway. There's no Isser Deiraisa. It's just a Chumrah, and these are the rules of Ksamim or more mekel. His son, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Yavitz, also has a tshuva about this, following up on his father, Shut Shelas Yavitz, Chelik Aleph Siman Samach Tes. He writes, when my father wrote in Tshuva Samach Zayin to be mekel, to use the Gris bunnen, so Avaraya from Yeredeya, there's Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chaviv, the Mechaber of the Ein Yaakov, so the Beis Yosef had a work of his that's Mevar Halachas Eir Chaim in Yeredeya. We don't have it anymore, I believe, but we just have whatever passages the Beis Yosef quotes. So Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chaviv is talking about a kulya in the context of treifus, and what if the kulya shrank to the size of a poil? So he asks, whatever the question is, not getting into it, he says the poil is more than a grape. How does that stem with whatever? So, but what do we see? Just derech hagav, taking that out of context. He says the poil is greater than a grape, so that must mean, probably, the Rebbe says, that whenever we say a poil in Shas, it must mean they're a really big one. Because otherwise, all the other ones are smaller than a grape. So what was his question? If he's saying Lashon Hiktina Kapoil must be from Chazal, and he's saying that is larger than Arava, so obviously you see that poil, when I just say the word poil, I assume we're talking about the large one. Arva Tzarech. Is Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chaviv such a bigger mucker than Chacham Tzvi and Rabbi Yaakov Emden's eyes? Lav Dafka, but maybe he had Divrei Kabbalah. Maybe he was coming with taka more of a tradition. It's at least a bit of a raya. And then he says, I found a big raya to my father in Yerushalmi. There's a famous Chazal in Yerushalmi that Ein Merubah B'Maisa Breishis. There's nothing square. So you might be familiar with that Yerushalmi. I think the Rebbe writes about it somewhere. But what's less known is that the Yerushalmi asks from this. It says, Gris hakilki merubah. How does that stem? So one of the answers in Yerushalmi is that, this is the exception. Or maybe the things that grow are different. But you have this idea in Yerushalmi that the Gris hakilki is square. So he says, which bean does that fit? If you go with the Yerushalmi that it's taka meant to be a square, so then you see that the Gris bean, you split it in half, it looks like a square. And he says, I'm surprised my father didn't mention this. Hiniach makam. So ein safek bedavar, hein advarim shenimsuru misinai mipi agvura, and he supports what his father says. And the Kavitz of Eitz Chaim, Baba 45, issue number 22, from Tafshin Ayin Daled, they printed additional Hagoyas of Yaakov Emden that he wrote in the margins of his copy, And they also cite other Mekayros where Yaakov Emden continues the discussion in Moyer Ktsiya and elsewhere. Interestingly, it seems that throughout this entire discussion, neither he nor his father, it never occurred to them to actually try to measure this bean against the Adashim, to try to see if the two things match up. That could have been a factor in this discussion, but he never doesn't seem to ever get to that. So before we move further, so like I said, in this generation, you have some who are back on the topic of the Gris Shel Poel. So in Tchumen, number 26 from Tafshin Samach Vav, there's an essay, Hakina v'Hapishpish, Hagris v'Haturmis Behilchas Nida. There's also another essay online about the Poel in general. So the first article in Tchumen identifies the louse as the common louse. There's the louse on the body and there's the louse on the head. It's exactly the louse that we were familiar with. And then this professor mentions that based on the size of the louse, and even based on the amount of blood that the louse sucks, because obviously that's why they're on the person's body, so there's additional blood in the louse, but with all of that together, if you look up the measurements, the Yereim's question essentially still stands, how that aligns with the Gris. When it comes to identifying the Poel or the Gris, so he says, one assumes that it is the standard bean known as you look it up on Wikipedia, the broad bean, the fava bean, the faba bean, the bean. Still the standard bean today. In the time of Chazal, they split it in half. That's why it's called the Gris. Gris means to cut, to split. Today, still there are a number of varieties within the Poel itself, and of course, we know there are pods, and in the pods are the seeds. We're talking about the seeds in the pods. So they're called seeds. So these seeds can differ in size depending on the variety. He says that Yehuda Felix, who was a big expert on botany and zoology in Tanakh and Chazal, he argues that the Poel of Chazal must have not been as large as the Poel today, which is 2 centimeters or more. He says it's a different variety that's not bigger than 1 centimeter. Maybe that would work with the Yereim Taka if you go with that Havana. But, he says, as we shall see, the ungenommen shear that we have today fits actually very nicely with the size of the regular bean, 2 centimeters, 20 millimeters. That's more or less the standard shear that we have today. So that actually fits nicely with looking up that bean. And then he goes on to summarize the discussion in Achreinim. So, you can actually take the discussions in the Achrayim and maybe connect it to this more contemporary discussion about the Poel itself. But as we said, most Achrayim said there's nothing wrong with the larger Shiurim, like the Alter Rebbe said, the Biksamim Shanu Chachamim Kegris Shel Poel Stam, V'lei Pirshu Be'eza Poel, Hilchach Misharim Be'eza Sheyizdamin Lanu, V'afilu Hu Gadol Min HaKilki, the Biksamim Hilchan Lahakil, V'mlein Izdamin Lanu Akal Panim Ein Lahachmir B'pachas Min HaKilki, Shizkiru Chachamim Gabi Negam B'feidish. So that's some of the background to what the Alter Rebbe is saying there in Tzivkat Yud Gimel. And what is a Gris HaKilki, according to this individual? He says it must be a slightly larger variety of that bean. The second article on the topic, the article online, points out they actually have Rishonim that mention the word faba. He says the Aruch writes faba, the Reb Matz and Kalayim writes faba, the Rambam writes in Arabic, al-ful, the word full in Arabic till today means this bean. He also points out that the Gabe Kilki, the Rambam writes in Nagayim, Kilki miyuchas l'makim, Haya hapol shel esa makim gadol v'noitel ribua. So this idea that it's just a slightly larger variety of the same thing. And then he points out that, generally they are rather square-like or rectangular. And then he points out that you can connect it to the Chacham Tzvi, who also touched on this. In that article, which I guess I'll share soon, there's actually a picture. You can see a picture of, I have it here somewhere. You have a picture of fava beans next to a ruler, and you can get a sense of the size. Oh, here. Just not that it's that helpful, but of course you can't trust the size of the picture, which can get reshaped many times. But here's a picture of fava beans, and next to a ruler, at least the long side looks more than 2.5 centimeters. Maybe when you square it out, maybe it's about 2 centimeters. Now we get to the next stage of the discussion, both in just getting from Shita to Shita and Achreinim, and also the next stage in the development of how it changes from talking about the Gris or Adashim, and it turns into pictures or coins, and that's the Me'ilt Staka. So first of all, who is the Me'ilt Staka? A few people asked, who is he? Because all of a sudden he's the center of attention here. So he lived at the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s. He was a Rav, a Pesach in Bohemia, Prague, known as the Me'ilt Staka after the Sefer. He was an Einik of the Maram of Prague. He grew up in Prague. He made a tremendous impact, a mark on the world of halacha in his very short lifetime, and he passed away at the age of 34. So everything that he wrote is before that. He passed away in the year Tuf Ayin Gimel. He prepared the Me'ilt Staka for print, and it was printed after his lifetime in the year Tuf Kuf Yud Zayin, 1757, anonymously, but everyone knew and everyone knows that it was him. So we're going to take a look now at the Shut Me'ilt Staka with the time we have left. It's a long tshuva, we're going to shorten it. He says, I was asked by someone, as a Maisa Shahaya, there was a woman sitting, Upanel Shalmata, Toichois Al Kera Arisa Shel Katan. So somehow she was pressing, her body, that part of her body was pressing against the leg of a baby, of a crib. And then she found a stain on that leg of the crib. And now the question is, it's really going to come down to what the exact size of a gris is. So they want to know what's the sheer kesem meduktak. And number two, is this thing makabel tumah or not? That depends on how large the leg is, or the crib. That's a separate cheshbon. So they reached out to him. This is his field of expertise. So he says, on the first question about gris shel ksamim, so he says, whatever shapes you'll find in Sifrei Tfus, and I'm not sure what he's referring to, but we attribute the tziyurim to him, but there must have been something beforehand. He says, they're not accurate. He says, the guy, all the guy, the matbis does is he finds 9 adashim and he just sticks them in a square, but they're not paying any attention to the correct size, the correct shape. And he says, by the way, if you go with 36 sidus, with 36 hairs, that's going to be way too small to hold 9 adashim. If you go with the idea that it's the sidus shabarosh, think about it. The amount of hairs that fit on the head, it's not going to be that many adashim. You're going to have really tiny adashim. And Alter Rebbe Taka gets into this in Sifkat Yud Aleph. But you see the Ramah and the Haggais and Shulchan Aruch Taka changed it, and he changed it to Gufei Shel Adam. But it's still a little difficult. Where in the Gufei Shel Adam? It's tricky to measure sinus. And anyway, where did the Ramah get this from? Assuming that he taka meant it, he was taka being medayik and changing it from Rosh to Guf, must be maybe the same kasha, that the Tes Adashim are way too big compared to 36 sinus on the head. But either way, we're not enough information here. We're still a little stuck on what is the shear of 36 sinus and what is the shear of 9 Adashim. So the sinus is confusing, but the Adashim is also confusing. You think it's easier to figure out 9 Adashim, right? No, same Akaitis that were mentioned by the previous. In Kolel it says, Beidinis, Mitzris. In Maisris you have this Rambam about the pointy end. Shnei Tanoim halalu einam ba'adashim hayidum lanu. I don't know what the Rambam is saying, that they're pointy and that they're in the desert. Hamtzvi also touched on this. So we can't go with the hair, that's confusing. We can't go with the Adashim. So that's explaining the question. So he says, I'm going to start by pointing out that what the Ramah said, when the Ramah said Gufei Shel Adam, that was definitely a good call to say that, because it's certainly not going to go with the head. And it must be based on all these Yishayim that said, Shir Tes Adashim, Lamad Vav Sidus, based on the Mishnah Negoim. And he says the Mishnah Negoim, he has a ayah, the Mishnah Negoim are clearly talking about the Guf and not the Rosh. And where did they get this from, Bechlal? Where did they, in Nida it says Gris Shel Poel, and in Negoim it says Gris HaKilki. How did these Rishonim Taka decide that it's the same thing? Yesh Leimar, that, the shear of Gris Shel Ksamim is Lahakal. So they decided to go with the largest shear that they could find. And they assume that the Gris Shel Poel must be the same size. It says Gris Shel Poel, it's not to tell you not a Gris HaKilki. It's just telling you that it doesn't have to be square like a Gris HaKilki is square. In a Goyim it has to be square dafka. Gris Shel Poel means it could be even if it's elongated, as long as you have the shetach. And then he goes into big arichas about the head and the hairs, the head versus the body. You see Bekitzer Taka and the Alter Rebbe in Sivkat and Yud Aleph, and the She'eres Yehuda says, B'Shem his brother, the Alter Rebbe, Kim Asher Chriach, HaMe'il Tztaka B'das HaNamal Liyas HaSayres Kamosh and Kvuas B'Gufa Shel Adam, V'lei Kamosh and Kvuas B'Reishai, V'Hev Yidayim Imichya, B'Zed Tzadku Dvar Mo'ed B'Ein Rabbeinu Ach Morzal. That was one thing of the Me'il Tztaka that the Alter Rebbe still appreciated even after his Chazara. Now that I've proven that the hairs are supposed to be beguf, not bereish, the reish is too crowded. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Still not clear because even on the body, there's different concentrations of hair on the body. He's mitzayin to the Tshuvas Divrei Shmuel, and then he gets into a whole pilpul as to how the hairs are supposed to. Let's say there's 4 adasha to hair. How are they supposed to fit? The Alter Rebbe also gets into that in the second paragraph in Sivkat Yud Aleph. So he says, now that we've dealt with that confusion with the Sidus, let's talk back to the Adashim. He says, in my opinion, it's the Adashim, the Medinas Elu. Gets into the whole question with the Rambam. The Rambam seems to be describing something else. We don't have time. He gets to the conclusion that we've got to say that it's got to be the regular Adashim. Whatever the Rambam is saying, we have to reinterpret it. Okay? We still, even with the lentils that we have, there's still different varieties, different sizes. So he says, we have the Dovid who says, use the biggest Gris. So he said, use the biggest Gris. He never said, use the biggest Adashim that you could find. So he a bit repetitively says, Mumuz that you can't use the biggest Adashim you could find. Probably they meant, Mistamahain Habeinanim. Only the Gris could be the largest. But the 9 Adashim, average ones, are the ones that match that shear. And that's cited by the Alter Rebbe Bekitzer in Sivkat Yud Gimel. Still, let's say it's Beinanim. What are the Beinanim? So I went and checked, and he says, I think it should be the largest variety that we have. I thought we're looking for the Beinanim. Based on all the information that I have, I think that our largest must be equivalent to the Mishnah's Beinani. There must have been a bigger one. It brings a raya from the Beis Yosef and Simon Samach Vav about the yellow in an egg, that somehow corresponds to the size of the Adasha Gedoyla. So there must be larger ones. Right? The Chacham Tzvi also mentioned that the Taka were larger ones in Mitzrayim. So the largest one in Europe is the Beinani of Mishnayos. Now how do we measure it? Next question. Try to be Mekatzer. Do we have to actually measure it scientifically, or can we just take a general look at it and get an impression? So he brings a raya from Erevin that the Chazal say that even Shiur de Rabbanon, you can't generally rely on Oimed Das, you have to measure. So Bazoi, the same goes here. Now how do you measure? So he says, Dikdakti, just give me another 2 minutes, I apologize. Dikdakti, ki habeinanis, b'min habeinanis, the average bean of the average type, haya kenekev grad. What's grad? So in the Sefer today, Midrash V'Shiuri Torah of Chaim Benish, he says grad is actually the word carat that we use in precious stones. So kenekev carat echad betas bechinas hamargalias. So there was some kind of pearl measuring plate, and it measured in carats, and the beinus of the bean matches kenekev grad. And you see in She'eres Yehuda that he writes that Alter Rebbe couldn't get to the bottom of that one. He says, Yaga Ma'oid, it's based on the tas of Chinas Margalias, Shekredin test. He couldn't get one. If you take the big one, if you take the big Adashim, that's the Shnei Grad, 2 carats. And Benish says that it more or less fits. If you make the cheshbon, the size of a carat today is 6.2 millimeters. And based on the Me'il Tztaka's final drawings, it all stems. He says, then I decided I wanted to have a more accurate, more specific measurement. So he said, I saw that 9 small lentils are the equivalent of 280 gargadei shumshimim. Now, even though today that's used to refer to sesame, but it's been my impression always from Achreinim that they always use it to refer to poppy, which makes sense. Tiny black seeds. So you can fit 280 into that space. If you use the larger beans, then it's 390. Says, and now I've converted this into images based on experts in geometry to show you what that looks like in different shapes and sizes. So just to show you here, not so small, but this of course is a picture of a picture. But you see here that he printed a number of different shapes, which he explains, he describes them. He says that, of course, the question is, can the blood of lice actually spread that big? But again, we're going to ignore that question. We're just going to say lahakal. He says, I have an actual square, and then these different shapes, and then the circle, and he has a large square and a large circle, and a small square and a small circle, depending on whether you want to go with adashim gedolim that he had at that time, or adashim beinonius that he had at that time. What are these actual shapes we're concluding now? What are those actual, what are the sizes? So Benish writes, if you measure, you have to get the original copy, because otherwise, just like this, you can't rely on this printout that I have here. Even the second tfus of Me'il Tzedakah, they said you couldn't rely on, because the paper was a slightly different size, and certainly in the last 100 years when they had photo prints, it could be a totally different size. She says the square was about 18 by 18 millimeters, and the circle had a diameter of 21 millimeters. For the equivalent would be a nickel. A nickel here in the United States has a diameter of 21 millimeters. So that, if you go with the Shiur Beinoni, the Adashim Beinonim of the Me'il Tzedakah, the smaller circle, that's 21 millimeters. And in the next Shiur, Mitzvah Hashem on Sunday, we'll talk about the Plesi and the Alter Rebbe's first teretz, his Chazara, and all the additional aspects in today's halachic discussions.